On a sunlit morning along Northern California's Highway 9, Daniel Cooper was on his way to work when he was forced to brake for a collision ahead. A mother bobcat had tried to get her babies safely to the other side, but her desperate attempt to cross the road ended in tragedy. Before grief could settle, 3 tiny shapes slipped from the grass, spotted, trembling, and calling for a response the wild could no longer give. They were alone, helpless, and just feet from speeding cars. To interfere could be deadly, but to do nothing was a certain death sentence. With their survival hanging by the thinnest thread, could these helpless babies overcome the impossible odds? What happened next will leave you stunned. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Highway 9, painting the asphalt in golden streaks that promised another scorching day in Northern California. Daniel Cooper adjusted his rearview mirror and took a sip of lukewarm coffee from his thermos, grateful for the early start. At 62, he'd been photographing wildlife for the local paper for nearly 2 decades. But the assignment ahead, documenting the restoration efforts at Pine Ridge Nature Reserve, felt routine. Little did he know that this ordinary Tuesday morning would transform into one of the most profound experiences of his life. The 2-lane highway wound through the foothills like a dark ribbon, flanked by towering ponderosa pines and patches of drought-resistant manzanita. Daniel knew this stretch well. It was prime wildlife territory where the human world collided too often with the natural one. He'd photographed enough roadside memorials, both human and animal, to understand the deadly mathematics of speed versus reaction time. As he rounded a gentle curve near mile marker 47, brake lights flashed red ahead. Daniel's practiced hands brought his pickup to a smooth stop, assuming it was the usual morning congestion near the reservoir turnoff. But something in the way the truck ahead sat askew, its hazard lights blinking frantically, made his photographer's instincts prickle. He pulled onto the shoulder and grabbed his camera bag out of habit, though he immediately sensed this wasn't a moment for documentation. Walking toward the commotion, he saw a young man in a construction vest standing beside his Ford F-150, his face pale as parchment, hands trembling as he spoke into his phone. I didn't see it. It darted out so fast. The man stammered, his voice carrying across the still morning air. Daniel's chest tightened as he approached. There, lying motionless before the truck's bumper, was a bobcat mother. Her tawny coat, marked with those distinctive black spots that had always reminded Daniel of ancient hieroglyphs, was still lustrous in the morning light. But the unnatural angle of her body told the story's ending before he could even check for breathing. The construction worker, barely 25, Daniel guessed, was named Tyler Morrison. "She came out of nowhere," Tyler repeated, his voice cracking. "I tried to brake, but she was already under the wheels." God, I've never hit anything before. Daniel placed a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. "These things happen, son. Bobcats are crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk. She probably couldn't judge your speed correctly." Even as he offered comfort, Daniel's heart ached for the magnificent creature whose life had been cut short by the intersection of 2 worlds that had never learned to coexist peacefully. Before the weight of loss could fully settle, movement in the roadside grass caught Daniel's eye. 3 tiny shapes stumbled forward, their bodies low to the ground, moving with the uncertain gait of the very young. Bobcat kittens, no more than 8 weeks old by Daniel's estimation. Their eyes wide and golden in the morning light, fur spiked with fear. Their cries, hoarse, broken mews that seemed too large for such small bodies, pierced the morning air as they searched for their mother. The largest kitten, braver or perhaps more desperate than its siblings, ventured onto the asphalt, its spotted coat catching the light. It approached its mother's still form, nudging her with its tiny pink nose, the mewing growing more frantic when she didn't respond. The two smaller kittens hung back, pressed against each other at the road's edge, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion that was almost unbearably human in its expression. Daniel's hands moved instinctively to his phone, though his fingers fumbled with the screen. He'd programmed the number years ago, never imagining he'd need it for something so urgent. The phone rang once, twice, before a calm voice answered. "Greenwood Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, this is Margaret." "Margaret, it's Daniel Cooper. I'm on Highway 9 near mile marker 47. We have an emergency. 3 Bobcat kittens. Mother's dead from a vehicle strike. They're right here on the road. Send help quickly, please." "Stay calm, Daniel. Keep people back, but don't try to capture them yourself. We're 15 minutes out. Can you manage traffic?" "Yes, I'll handle it." As Daniel ended the call, more vehicles had begun to accumulate. He jogged back to his truck, retrieving the emergency cones he always carried, a photographer's habit of being prepared for roadside shoots. Working quickly, he created a buffer zone, waving cars into the opposite lane when safe. Tyler helped, his guilt channeling into action as he directed traffic from the other end. An older couple in an RV had stopped, the woman already out with her phone, filming. "Martha, get back in the vehicle," her husband called, but she waved him off. "Those poor babies," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Harold, we have to help them." Daniel intercepted her gently but firmly. "Ma'am, I know you want to help, but these are wild animals. They're terrified and can be dangerous. The rehabilitation team is on their way." The minutes stretched like hours. The kittens had retreated to their mother's body, curled against her cooling form in a tableau that would haunt Daniel's dreams for weeks to come. One kitten, the smallest, kept pawing at her face, as if trying to wake her. The sound it made wasn't quite a purr, wasn't quite a cry, but something in between that spoke of a grief that transcended species. The Greenwood van arrived in 13 minutes. Daniel had been counting. Sarah Williams emerged first, her movements confident despite her slight frame. At 38, she'd been rehabilitating wildlife for over a decade, specializing in native predators. Her team of 2 assistants followed, carrying specialized equipment that looked like a cross between fishing nets and pet carriers. "Daniel," Sarah nodded, assessing the scene with practiced eyes. "Mother's been gone how long?" "Maybe 20 minutes now. The kittens won't leave her." Sarah's expression softened for just a moment before her professional mask returned. "They're young enough that they might accept rehabilitation. If they were much older..." She didn't need to finish. Daniel knew that bobcat kittens past a certain age rarely adapted to human intervention, their wild instincts too strong to accept help from the very species they'd learned to fear. The rescue itself was a dance of patience and swift action. Sarah and her team worked with the precision of surgeons and the gentle persistence of parents. The first kitten, the brave one who'd ventured onto the road, was also the most difficult. It fought with a ferocity that belied its size, tiny claws raking across Sarah's thick gloves, its screams of rage and fear echoing across the highway. "Don't be fooled by the cuteness," Sarah murmured to Daniel, who'd refused to leave despite her suggestions that he could go. "These little ones are already apex predators in training. This one's particularly spicy." The second kitten tried to run, making it almost to the tree line before Sarah's assistant, a young man named Marcus, managed to guide it into a carrier with a combination of barriers and gentle herding. It huddled in the corner once captured, its eyes wide and wet, looking for all the world like a child who'd gotten separated from its parent in a crowd. The third kitten, the smallest one who'd been pawing at its mother, was the most heartbreaking. It didn't fight or run. It simply went limp when Sarah picked it up, as if all the fight had drained out with the realization that its mother wasn't coming back. Sarah cradled it for a moment, whispering something Daniel couldn't hear, before placing it carefully in its own carrier. "What about her?" Tyler asked, gesturing to the mother's body. He'd been standing sentinel the entire time, his face drawn with guilt. "We'll take her too," Sarah said quietly. "She deserves dignity, and her body will help teach veterinary students about bobcat anatomy. Nothing goes to waste in nature, even in death." As the Greenwood team loaded the carriers into their van, Daniel found himself following. "Sarah, I need to know they'll be okay." She studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing something in his eyes. The look of someone who'd witnessed tragedy and felt responsible for its aftermath. "Why don't you come by tomorrow? We'll have finished their initial health assessments by then." That night, sleep eluded Daniel entirely. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw them again. The panic in those golden eyes, the hoarse cries that seemed to echo in his quiet bedroom, the fragile bodies pressed against their mother's still form. Would they survive? Bobcat kittens needed their mother's milk for at least 2 months, and these ones looked barely weaned. Would they accept formula? Would they maintain their wild instincts despite human intervention? The questions haunted him, each one a thread in an invisible web that had somehow bound him to those 3 small lives. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Greenwood before they officially opened. The Rehabilitation Center sat on 20 acres of donated land, a patchwork of buildings and enclosures designed to give wild animals a second chance. Sarah met him at the main building, coffee in hand, looking tired but smiling. "They made it through the night," she said without preamble. "That's always the first hurdle." Relief washed over Daniel with such force that he had to steady himself against the doorframe. "All 3? "All 3. Come on, I'll show you, but we need to be quiet and move slowly. They're still in critical care." The nursery was dimly lit, designed to minimize stress on its temporary residents. Through a viewing window, Daniel could see the 3 carriers, now equipped with heating pads and soft blankets. The kittens were awake but calm, each in its own space to prevent them from becoming too dependent on each other. A mistake, Sarah explained, that could hinder their eventual release. "The feisty one, I'm calling him Scout, took formula after a few attempts. He's got the best chance. The middle one, Pounce, is eating, but she's skittish. The smallest..." Sarah paused. "We're calling her Ember. She's the concern, not eating much, very lethargic. It's not uncommon after trauma like this." Over the following weeks, Daniel became a fixture at Greenwood. He couldn't explain the pull these orphans had on him, but every morning before work, he'd stop by. He learned the rhythms of wildlife rehabilitation, the delicate balance between intervention and maintaining wildness. Sarah became his teacher, sharing the profound responsibility of returning wild animals to where they belonged. "People think we're trying to make them pets," Sarah explained one afternoon, preparing specialized formula enriched with the exact nutrients bobcat milk would provide. But it's the opposite. Every interaction is calculated to keep them wild. We wear different clothes each feeding so they don't imprint on a specific person. We never talk to them or comfort them the way you would a domestic animal. It seems cruel, but it's the kindest thing we can do. Daniel watched as she fed Scout through a specialized nipple system that prevented the kitten from seeing human faces. The young bobcat attacked the bottle with enthusiasm, his tiny paws kneading the air in an instinct as old as his species. At 3 pounds now, up from barely 2 when rescued, Scout was thriving. Pounce had developed her own personality. Cautious but curious, always watching from the corners of her enclosure with those distinctive tufted ears swiveling to catch every sound. She'd graduated to eating chunks of rabbit and quail, tearing into them with a precision that reminded Daniel these were not house cats, but wild predators temporarily in human care. But it was Ember who captured Daniel's heart most completely. The smallest kitten had struggled those first 2 weeks, barely eating, barely moving. Sarah had been prepared for the worst. Survival rates for traumatized orphan bobcats were only about 60%. But on day 15, something shifted. Ember began eating with tentative interest, then genuine hunger. By week 3, she was playing with enrichment toys, feathers and fur attached to mechanical devices that mimicked prey movement. "She's got what I call the quiet strength," Sarah observed one morning, watching Ember stalk a motorized mouse with intense concentration. Not as bold as Scout, not as reactive as Pounce, but there's something steady in her. She'll make it. As the kittens grew, so did Daniel's involvement in their story. He began photographing their progress, always from a distance, always with Sarah's permission, creating a visual diary of their journey. But more than that, he became an advocate. The image of that morning haunted him, but it also inspired him. He started speaking at local community centers, showing his photographs, sharing the story of 3 orphans who'd lost everything in an instant of mistimed crossing. Every year in California, we lose approximately 400 bobcats to vehicle strikes, Daniel would tell his audiences, watching their faces shift from polite interest to genuine concern. That's 400 mothers, fathers, and kittens who don't make it across. But we can change that. Wildlife corridors, reduced speeds during dawn and dusk, simple awareness. These things save lives. Tyler Morrison, the young construction worker who'd hit the mother, became one of Daniel's most dedicated supporters. The guilt that had paralyzed him that morning transformed into action. He convinced his construction company to sponsor wildlife crossing signs along Highway 9 and volunteered at Greenwood on weekends, maintaining enclosures and preparing food. "I can't bring her back," Tyler told Daniel one afternoon, watching the kittens through the viewing window. "But maybe I can prevent it from happening again." By month 3, the kittens had graduated to Greenwood's large outdoor enclosures, half-acre spaces designed to mimic natural habitat. Daniel watched them through binoculars from an observation blind, marveling at their transformation. Scout had developed into a powerful young male, already showing the broad face and muscular build of an adult bobcat. His coat had deepened to a rich tawny gold, the black spots and bars distinctive as fingerprints. Pounce had become the most skilled hunter of the 3, able to catch live prey with an efficiency that would serve her well in the wild. She developed the patience that bobcats were famous for, able to remain motionless for an hour before exploding into action with deadly precision. And Ember, sweet, resilient Ember, had found her confidence. Though still the smallest, she'd become the most resourceful, often finding creative solutions to the puzzles and challenges Sarah introduced to keep their minds sharp. She was frequently seen practicing her climbing skills, scaling the tall pine trees in the enclosure with an agility that spoke of generations of evolutionary perfection. "They're ready," Sarah announced one October morning, 6 months after the rescue. "Their hunting skills are excellent. They show appropriate fear response to humans, and they're the right age for dispersal. It's time. The release site had been carefully chosen, a protected area in the Sierra foothills, far from major roads, with abundant prey and existing bobcat populations that would accept new members. The habitat assessment had taken weeks, ensuring water sources, denning sites, and territorial boundaries that wouldn't conflict with established cats. The morning of the release was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the mountains glow gold. Daniel was there, of course, along with Tyler, Martha, and Harold, the couple from the RV, and a small group of Greenwood supporters who'd followed the Kittens' journey through Daniel's weekly newspaper columns. The three carriers were placed at the edge of a meadow, facing a dense stand of pines and undergrowth that promised shelter and hunting grounds. Sarah opened Scout's carrier first. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in a blur of tawny fur and spotted coat, Scout burst free, crossing the meadow in powerful bounds before disappearing into the forest without a backward glance. Pounce was next, moving more cautiously, her head swiveling to take in her surroundings. She paused at the forest edge, looking back just once, not at the humans, but at the last carrier, before melting into the shadows with the fluid grace of her kind. Ember took the longest. She emerged slowly, blinking in the bright morning sun. For a heart-stopping moment, she turned toward the gathered humans, those golden eyes, so like her mother's, seeming to take in each face. Daniel could have sworn she looked directly at him, a moment of connection that transcended species. Then she turned and walked. Not ran, but walked with quiet dignity into her new life. Will we know what happens to them? Martha asked, wiping tears from her cheeks. Each is wearing a small tracking collar that will fall off in a year, Sarah explained. We'll monitor them for the first few months, make sure they're establishing territories and hunting successfully. After that, they're on their own, as it should be. As the group dispersed, Daniel lingered, his camera hanging unused around his neck. He thought about that morning 6 months ago, about the mother bobcat who died trying to lead her kittens across a human-made barrier. Her death had been a tragedy, but from it had come something extraordinary. A community of people who'd come together to right a wrong, to give 3 small lives the chance their mother had died trying to provide. The tracking data over the following months showed all 3 kittens thriving. Scout had claimed a territory 8 miles from the release site. Pounce had settled near a creek system rich with prey, and Ember, true to her resilient nature, had traveled the farthest, establishing herself in a pristine valley that hadn't seen bobcats in a decade. Daniel continued his advocacy work, his photographs and stories reaching thousands. The Highway 9 Wildlife Crossing Project, inspired by the mother bobcat's death, received funding the following year. Sarah reported a 40% decrease in wildlife vehicle strikes within 18 months of its completion. But for Daniel, the true measure of success came 2 years later. He was photographing wildflowers in the Sierra foothills when movement caught his eye. Through his telephoto lens, he saw her. A female bobcat with 3 kittens of her own, teaching them to hunt in a sunny meadow. The mother had a distinctive small white patch on her chest, a marking he'd memorized from hours of observation. It was Ember. She'd survived, thrived, and was now passing on the ancient knowledge of her species to a new generation. As Daniel watched her demonstrate a hunting crouch to her eager offspring, he thought about the cycles of life and death, loss and renewal that define the natural world. That mother bobcat on Highway 9 hadn't died in vain. Her sacrifice had led to this moment. her daughter teaching her grandchildren the skills they'd need to navigate a world increasingly dominated by humans. Daniel took no photographs that day. Some moments he'd learned were too sacred for documentation. Instead, he simply watched as Ember led her kittens into the forest, their spotted coats dappling in the afternoon sun, wild and free as nature intended. The invisible thread that had bound him to those 3 orphan kittens had not broken with their release. It had simply transformed, becoming part of the larger tapestry of conservation, compassion, and coexistence that would define his remaining years. As he drove home that evening, carefully observing the speed limit through the wildlife corridor zones, Daniel thought about all the travelers on Highway 9 who would never know the story of the 3 kittens. They'd pass through those mountains, perhaps catching a glimpse of eyeshine in their headlights, or spotting a tawny form melting into the forest, never realizing they were witnessing the continuation of a story that began with tragedy but ended with triumph. And perhaps that was as it should be. The wild keeps its secrets, sharing them only with those patient enough to look, caring enough to help, and wise enough to know when to step back and let nature take its course. Daniel had been privileged to be part of that secret world, if only for a moment, and it had changed him forever. The Bobcats were out there, living their wild lives, raising their young, claiming their territories. And because of the efforts of Sarah, Tyler, and everyone who'd cared enough to help, they would continue to do so for generations to come. It was, Daniel reflected as he pulled into his driveway, the best possible ending to a story that had begun with the worst possible morning.